Hello everyone, this is James Quick, Microsoft Technical Evangelist in South Florida. On my screen right now you can see my contact information. My Twitter handle is @jquickwit. My blog is blogs.msdn.com/quick_thoughts. And if you're local to the South Florida area, my meetup is the Miami Fort Lauderdale Windows app developers. So I'm here today to talk about data binding. And these videos are to complement a 5-part blog series I recently published on data binding. If we move over to my blog, you can see, if I scroll up, we can see DataBinding-Part1 is the basic idea. So this is where we just introduce what data binding is and how it works and some of the concepts behind it. So I'll go ahead and get started with that introduction. According to MSDN.com, the data binding is the process that establishes a connection between the application UI and the business logic. So obviously the two things we're talking about here are application UI and business logic. The application UI is just your user interface. It's how things are arranged, how your application looks, that sort of stuff. Then the business logic is going to be all of the logic that goes on behind the scenes. And the connection that we're talking about here basically revolves around what information is to be displayed on the user interface and how best to display it and manage that data. So the simple example that we're going to work through in the next coming videos deals with displaying movie information to the UI. So the movie information will be pretty simple. We'll just have a title, a rating, so PG-13, G, whatever it is, and then one for the year that the movie came out. So in a very real world example, if we were to display that information, we wouldn't necessarily want to display, let's say, the same movie each time, right? We might want that information to change. And data binding helps again create that connection between that data that's changing and the UI so that the UI is updated to reflect the changes made to the data. And this is the real power of data binding because it allows the developer to treat the UI and the data, the business logic, completely separately and independent of one another. So he can kind of work on one and not worry about the other. Now there are 4 terms that are common in data binding, and I'll go ahead and define them. The first is the binding target object, and that is the UI control to bind the data to. So in our example, we're going to use text blocks, and that'll be the binding target object. The target property is the property of the binding target object to bind. So the property of the text block that we want to bind to whatever piece of data is the text property. So we want to say our text of this text block is going to be bound to a certain piece of data. The binding source is the data object that we bind to the UI. So we are going to, in the next video, create a very simple movie class, and an instance of that object will be our binding source. And then the path to value is the path to the property of the binding source data object. So let's say we want to bind to our movie object instance. The path to value is going to be which property of that data source object we want to display for each text block. So 4 more things to add here are the different kinds of data binding. So the first is one-way, where changes to the data source automatically propagate to the UI. Then two-way, the same thing happens, but also if the UI were to change, it would also change the underlying data source. One-way to source is basically the reverse of one-way binding. So instead of changes to the data reflecting the UI, we will say that changes to the UI will reflect in the underlying data source. And then one time just causes the source property to initialize the target property, but subsequent changes do not propagate. So this is it's basically one time. After any subsequent changes will not cause any effect to either the data source or the UI. So that's the introduction to data binding, and in part 2 we're going to get more hands-on and do some actual coding. So stay tuned.